water jug slipped from Grace's hands the moment she heard the breathing. It shattered on the cellar floor, and the sound echoed through the darkness like a warning bell. She froze. The candle in her other hand trembled, throwing shaky shadows across the wine barrels that lined the stone walls. Somebody was down here. Somebody was hiding behind those barrels, and whoever it was, they were hurt. She could hear it in the breathing. Slow, heavy, painful. Every servant in the palace knew the rules. If you see something strange, you report it to the guards. If you hear something strange, you report it to the guards. If you find someone where they should not be, you run, and you report it to the guards. Grace had followed those rules for 3 years. Those rules had kept her alive under the cruel reign of Victor, the regent who now sat on the throne of the Black Moon Pack. But tonight, something inside her refused to run. Maybe it was the storm outside, so loud that no one would hear her if she screamed anyway. Maybe it was the strange pull in her chest, a feeling she could not explain, as if an invisible thread was dragging her forward. She lifted the candle higher, and stepped over the broken jug. Her wet shoes made soft sounds on the stone. The breathing stopped. Whoever was hiding knew she was coming. Grace reached the last row of barrels and raised the light. A man sat slumped against the wall, half hidden in shadow. His clothes were torn and soaked with rain. Dark stains spread across his shirt where he had been wounded. His skin was pale, far too pale, and his lips had a faint gray color that frightened her. One of his hands was pressed against his side. The other rested on the floor, ready to push himself up, though anyone could see he did not have the strength to stand. Then he lifted his face into the light, and Grace's whole world tilted. She knew that face. Everyone in the kingdom knew that face. It hung in a great golden frame in the main hall, draped in black mourning cloth. It was carved into the memorial stone in the palace gardens, where the pack still left flowers every full moon. It belonged to a man the entire Black Moon Pack had wept for. A man whose funeral she had watched from the servant balconies 3 years ago, tears running down her own cheeks along with everyone else's. Daniel, the Alpha King, the rightful ruler of the Black Moon Pack. The dead king was sitting in the cellar, and he was looking straight at her. "That is not possible," Grace whispered. Her voice came out thin and broken. "You died. The whole pack mourned you. There was a funeral. There was a body." The man's eyes, deep and gray like storm clouds, held hers. Even wounded, even half dead on a cellar floor, there was power in that gaze. The kind of power that made wolves lower their heads without knowing why. "There was a lie," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like he had not used it in a long time. A very expensive, very careful lie. Grace's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her mind raced through everything she knew. 3 years ago, King Daniel had ridden out to defend the northern border. Word came back that he had fallen in battle. His uncle Victor had taken the throne as regent, weeping in front of the whole pack, swearing to honor his nephew's memory. And then, slowly, like a shadow spreading across the land, everything had changed. Taxes doubled, then tripled. Food grew scarce in the villages. Guards patrolled the streets like the people were prisoners. Anyone who complained disappeared quietly in the night. The pack had learned to whisper. The pack had learned to bow. The pack had learned to survive. And now the true king was here, bleeding on the floor of his own cellar, 3 years too late. "I need you to listen to me," Daniel said. He tried to sit up straighter and failed, his face tightening with pain. "I know what this looks like. I know what you have been told. But I am asking you, whoever you are, do not call the guards." "Why should I believe you?" Grace asked. But even as she said it, she knew the question was pointless. She did believe him. Something deep inside her, deeper than reason, already knew this man was exactly who he appeared to be. "Because if Victor learns I am alive," Daniel said, "he will finish what he started 3 years ago. And this time, he will make sure of it." Grace stared at him. "What he started? You mean the battle at the border? You mean the enemy soldiers?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "There were no enemy soldiers. There was a cup of wine, poured by hands I trusted, laced with liquid silver. There was a cliff, and a river below it, and a man who was supposed to confirm I was dead. He got careless. The river carried me farther than anyone expected. A family of farmers pulled me out. They did not know who I was. I barely knew who I was. Silver poisoning does terrible things to our kind. It took me 3 years to remember my own name, to heal enough to walk. to make it back here. Grace's legs felt weak. She lowered herself onto an overturned crate because she did not trust herself to keep standing. Liquid silver. Every wolf knew what that meant. It was the cruelest thing you could do to one of their kind. It did not just harm the body. It silenced the wolf inside, cut a person off from their own soul. It was forbidden by every law of every pack in every land. And someone inside the royal family had used it on their own king. "Victor," she breathed. "My father's brother," Daniel said, and for a moment, the pain in his voice was worse than the pain in his body. "The man who taught me to ride, the man who stood beside me at my coronation and swore his loyalty before the moon itself." He closed his eyes briefly. "I came back too soon, I know that. I am not healed. I have no army, no allies, no proof. My wolf is still silent inside me. But when I heard what he has been doing to my people, I could not stay away another day." Rain hammered against the small cellar window high in the wall. Thunder rolled over the palace like the sky itself was angry. Grace sat in the flickering candlelight, staring at the impossible man in front of her, and understood with terrible clarity what her choices were. She could go upstairs and tell the guards. Victor would reward her, probably with gold, possibly with a better position. She would be safe, comfortable, protected, and the true king would die before sunrise, and Victor would rule forever, and everything would stay exactly as broken as it was. Or she could stay silent. She could help him, and if anyone ever found out, she would face the punishment for treason, which under Victor's rule meant she would simply vanish, like all the others who had crossed him, and no one would ever speak her name again. Grace was nobody, a maid, an orphan, the daughter of a poor market trader. She scrubbed floors and carried water and kept her eyes down. She was invisible, and being invisible had kept her breathing for 3 years. Then she looked at Daniel's face again, and a memory rose up from years ago, so sharp and clear it stole her breath. She had been 16. Her father was still alive then, selling vegetables from a small wooden cart in the lower market. A palace soldier, drunk and angry, had accused her father of cheating him. It was a lie. The soldier just wanted an excuse. He knocked the cart over, sent vegetables rolling through the mud, and raised his fist over the old man cowering on the ground. Grace had screamed. Nobody moved to help. Nobody ever helped. And then a rider in a dark cloak had pulled his horse to a stop, stepped down into the mud, and caught the soldier's arm mid-swing. The rider had pushed his hood back, and the whole market had gasped. The young king himself, barely crowned, out riding among his people. He had not shouted. He had not needed to. He looked at the soldier and said, quiet and cold, that a man who strikes the weak is not fit to wear the pack's colors. He stripped the soldier of his post on the spot. Then he knelt in the mud, in his fine clothes, and helped an old vegetable seller gather his ruined goods with his own royal hands. He never knew her name. He never even looked at her. He rode away, and the market buzzed about it for weeks, and Grace never forgot. That was the man bleeding in front of her now. That was the king Victor had poisoned and thrown off a cliff. "What is your name?" Daniel asked softly, watching her face. "Grace," she said. "Grace." He said it slowly, like he was memorizing it. "I will not ask you to risk your life for me. If you want to walk away and forget you ever saw me, I will not blame you. You owe me nothing." She opened her mouth to answer, and that was when she heard it. Boots, on the cellar stairs. Grace's blood turned to ice. Voices drifted down with the footsteps, rough and bored. Guards, at least 2 of them, maybe 3, coming down for their nightly check of the storage rooms, or coming to steal wine, like they often did when they thought no one was watching. It did not matter why they were coming. What mattered was that in less than a minute, they would round the corner with their lanterns, and the light would fall on the broken jug, and then on her, and then on the dead king sitting against the wall. Daniel moved, or tried to. His hand went to the floor, muscles tensing, some old instinct telling him to rise and fight. But his arms shook, and his wound pulled, and Grace saw the truth in one horrible second. He could not fight. He could not even stand. If those guards found him, it was over. Everything was over, before it had even begun. The boots came closer. A lantern's glow began to spread along the bottom of the stairwell. Grace did not think. Thinking would have taken too long. She crossed the space between them in 2 quick steps, dropped to her knees beside the fallen king, and pressed her hand gently but firmly over his mouth. His eyes went wide with surprise, storm gray locking onto hers in the candlelight. She leaned close, so close her words were barely more than breath against his ear. "Stay silent." Then she blew out the candle, and the darkness swallowed them both. The lantern light grew brighter. The voices grew louder. Grace crouched in the black space behind the barrels, one hand still resting against the king's face, feeling his ragged breath against her palm, feeling her own heart slamming against her ribs. The strange pull in her chest was stronger than ever now, humming like a plucked string, and she had no time to wonder what it meant. "I am telling you, I heard something break down here," one of the guards said, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. "Probably rats," said another. "This whole palace is full of rats, since the old cook left." "Rats do not break jugs, you fool. Get the light over here." The lantern glow swept across the cellar floor, sliding over stone and shadow, moving closer and closer to the broken pieces of the water jug, lying in plain sight, just a few steps from where the true king of the Black Moon Pack sat hidden in the dark, with a maid's trembling hand pressed over his mouth, and both their lives hanging by a single thread. Grace closed her eyes and did the only thing left to do. She stood up, stepped out from behind the barrels, and walked straight toward the guards. The lantern light hit Grace full in the face, and she raised her arm as if the brightness hurt her eyes. "Who goes there?" the first guard barked. He was a big man with a scar through his eyebrow, and his hand was already on the handle of his blade. "It is only me," Grace said. She let her voice shake, which was easy, because it wanted to shake anyway. "Grace. From the kitchen staff. Please, I did not mean any harm." The second guard lifted his lantern higher. He was younger, with a thin face and hungry eyes that swept over the cellar, over the barrels, over the broken jug on the floor. "What are you doing down here in the middle of the night?" This was the moment. Grace knew it the way a person knows they are standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong word, one nervous glance toward the back row of barrels, and everything ended here. So she did something she had learned from 3 years of surviving under Victor's rule. She told a lie wrapped inside the truth. "The head cook sent me for water and wine before dawn," she said. "The regent demanded an early breakfast tomorrow, a special one, and cook is in a terrible mood about it. I came down, and something ran across my foot in the dark. A rat, I think. I dropped the jug." She gestured miserably at the broken pieces. "Cook is going to take it out of my wages. Please do not report me. I cannot afford the fine, and I cannot afford the whipping post either." The two guards looked at each other. The big one relaxed slightly. Servants breaking things and begging not to be reported was the most ordinary story in the palace. It happened every week. But the young one did not relax. His eyes drifted past her, into the darkness behind the barrels. "You were down here in the dark. Where is your candle?" Grace's stomach dropped. The candle was behind the barrels, lying beside a hidden king, its wick still warm.
"It blew out when I jumped,"
she said. "The draft from the window. I was feeling my way back to the stairs when I heard you coming. Truthfully, I was glad. I hate the dark." The young guard took a step forward. Then another. He was moving toward the back row, lantern swinging, and Grace felt her whole body turn cold. She could see it all unfolding in her mind. The light falling across Daniel's boots, the shout, the blades, the end. So she did the most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life. She got between a suspicious guard and his target, and she made herself more interesting than the shadows. "Sir," she said quickly, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret, "if you are going to search back there, be careful of the third barrel from the wall. That is the regent's private reserve, the old vintage. Cook says the last guard who touched it lost his post the very next day, and nobody ever saw him around the palace again. I would not want trouble to find you over a few rats." The young guard stopped walking. In Victor's palace, that story was completely believable, because things like that happened all the time. People touched the wrong thing, asked the wrong question, stood in the wrong hallway, and then they were simply gone. Every guard knew it. Every guard feared it. The young man stared into the dark for a long moment, weighing his suspicion against his own survival, and Grace watched the fear win. "Rats," he muttered, stepping back. "This place is falling apart." The big guard laughed. "Told you. Come on. We still have the east wing to walk." He jabbed a finger at Grace. "Clean up that mess, girl, and get yourself a new candle before you break your neck down here." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," She bowed her head, and kept it bowed, the perfect picture of a frightened servant, until their boots faded up the stairs, and the door thudded shut above. Then her legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of a barrel, and breathed, just breathed, while her heartbeat slowly climbed down from her throat. When she slipped back behind the barrels and relit the candle with shaking hands, Daniel was watching her with an expression she could not read. Wonder, maybe, or disbelief. "The Regent's private reserve," he said quietly. "Is that true?" "I have no idea what is in that barrel," Grace admitted. "But fear works better than facts in this palace. Nobody checks a story when checking it might get them killed." Something moved through Daniel's storm-gray eyes then, something that looked almost like respect. 3 years ago, I commanded 10,000 wolves, he said. Tonight, my entire kingdom was defended by one maid and a made-up wine barrel. "Do not thank me yet," Grace said. "You cannot stay here. Those guards walk this cellar every night, and the next ones might be braver or drunker. I need to move you, and I need to do it before the storm ends, while the thunder can still cover the sound." Moving him turned out to be the hardest thing she had ever done. Daniel was tall, and even starved and wounded he was heavy, and his body had almost nothing left to give. She pulled his arm across her shoulders and took his weight, and together, they made their slow, staggering way through the servant passages, the forgotten veins of the palace that ran behind its walls. Grace knew them all. Invisible people learn invisible roads. Twice they had to stop and press into dark alcoves while footsteps passed. Once, Daniel's strength failed completely on a narrow stair, and they sat in the blackness for long minutes, his breathing rough and wet, her arms around him to keep him from sliding down the steps. The pull in her chest was constant now, that strange warm thread stretched between them, and she was too exhausted to be afraid of it. She took him to the one place in the palace that no one ever visited, the old servants' wing in the far north corner, closed off years ago after a fire damaged the roof, scheduled for repairs, that Victor never paid for. The room smelled of dust and old smoke, but the walls were sound, the floor was dry, and most importantly, the wing had been erased from everyone's memory. Even the guards' patrol routes skipped it entirely. Grace laid the King of the Black Moon pack down on a servant's narrow bed, under a blanket with holes in it, in a room where the wallpaper was peeling like autumn leaves. "It is not a palace," she said. "It is the safest room in the kingdom," Daniel answered, "because you chose it." His eyes were already sliding shut. Whatever will had carried him back home. Through 3 years of poison and pain, it had finally spent itself. But before sleep took him, his hand found her wrist, and his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Grace, why did you step out in front of those guards? You could have stayed hidden. If they had found me, they would never have known you were there." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the faint gray lines that traced his veins like frost on a window. Silver poisoning. She had heard the old stories about it, but seeing it was different. Seeing it made her furious, in a quiet, burning way she had never felt before. "Because I am tired," she said at last. "Tired of watching bad men win, because good people stay hidden. Everyone in this kingdom has been hiding for 3 years. Somebody had to step out first." She pulled the thin blanket up over him. "It just turned out to be me. Now sleep. If you die in my care after all that trouble, I will be very cross with you." The faintest ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Then he was gone, deep into sleep, and Grace sat on the floor beside the bed, until the storm outside faded to a whisper, guarding a dead king that only she knew was alive. The days that followed became a secret life stacked on top of her real one. By daylight, Grace was the same quiet maid she had always been. She scrubbed the same floors, carried the same trays, bowed to the same cruel overseers. But now every ordinary task hid a second purpose. When she cleared plates from the guards' mess, a bread roll and a slice of meat disappeared into the deep pocket sewn inside her apron. When she cleaned the healer's chambers, a small measure of herbs went missing from jars too full for anyone to notice. When she drew water, 1 bucket in every 5 found its way north. She learned quickly that stealing was the easy part. The hard part was the fear. It never left her now. It sat behind her ribs from the moment she woke, whispering that today was the day someone would notice, someone would follow, someone would ask why the kitchen maid walked toward the burned wing with her apron heavy. She learned to smile through the fear. She learned to yawn through it, complain about chores through it, laugh at other servants' jokes through it. Fear became a garment she wore under her uniform, and no one ever saw it, And every evening, in the dusty room at the end of the forgotten corridor, she watched a king fight his way back from the edge of death. The silver was the true enemy. The wound in his side closed slowly, far more slowly than a wolf's wound should, but it closed. The poison was different. It lived in him like winter lives in the ground. Some mornings he could stand and walk the length of the room, jaw tight, sweat on his brow, forcing his body to remember its strength. Other mornings he could barely lift his head, and the gray frost lines on his skin darkened, and Grace sat beside him, grinding herbs into bitter tea, and hiding how frightened she was. "Tell me about them," he said one evening, when the pain was bad, and he needed something to hold his mind above it. "My people. Tell me what these 3 years have really been." So she told him, not the way a report would tell it, with numbers and names, but the way a servant knew it, from the ground, from below. She told him about the baker's family in the lower town who watered their soup so the children could eat twice a day. She told him about the winter the firewood tax doubled, and the old ones who quietly did not survive it. She told him about the disappearances, how nobody said the words taken or arrested anymore. They just said gone, and everyone understood. She told him how the pack had stopped singing. That detail seemed to strike him hardest of all. The Black Moon Pack had always sung, at festivals, at harvests, at funerals, under every full moon. Now the nights were silent, because gatherings drew guards, and guards drew trouble. Daniel listened to all of it without looking away. She watched the words land on him like stones, and she watched him refuse to be crushed by them, and she understood something about him then. Victor sat on a throne, and ruled a kingdom of fear. This man lay in a servant's bed, too weak to stand some days, and he was still more of a king than his uncle would ever be, because he carried his people's pain like it was his own body. "When I take back the throne," he said quietly, "and I will take it back, Grace, I need you to hold me to something. The palace lies to kings. Advisors lie, ministers lie, even mirrors lie. You will tell me the truth, as the servants know it. Always. Even when I do not want it. Especially then. You are giving orders already," she said. "That is a good sign." He laughed, actually laughed, rough and unpracticed, like a door opening on rusted hinges, and the sound did something strange and warm to her chest that she firmly decided not to examine. It was 10 days into this hidden life when the first crack appeared. Grace was in the kitchen before dawn, kneading bread, when she heard 2 of the senior maids whispering by the pantry. She had long ago mastered the servant's art of listening while appearing deaf, and what she heard turned the dough cold under her hands. The steward had begun asking questions. Quiet ones. Why the healer's stock of feverfew ran low so fast this month. Why the bread count came up short twice in 1 week. Small things. Tiny things. The kind of things no one would ever notice in a great palace full of people. Except someone had noticed, because the steward did not ask questions for himself. Everyone knew who the steward truly served. He served the thin, quiet man in dark clothes who stood at Victor's shoulder during audiences and never seemed to blink. The regent's spymaster. The whispering maids moved on to other gossip, but Grace stood very still at the kneading table, flour on her hands, ice in her blood, understanding that somewhere in this palace, invisible to her, a thread had been picked up, and at the end of that thread, if it was followed carefully enough, patiently enough, sat a burned corridor, a dusty room, and a king who was not yet strong enough to run. Grace changed everything the very next morning. No more herbs from the healer's chambers. No more bread from the kitchen count. If the spymaster's people were watching the palace stores, then the palace stores had to become boring again, perfectly balanced, nothing missing, nothing wrong. She lay awake that whole night, building a new plan in her head, piece by piece, the way her father used to build his market stall, checking every joint twice. The answer, she realized, was outside the walls. Every 3rd day, servants were sent to the town market to buy what the palace did not grow itself. Grace volunteered for the duty, which surprised no one, because market duty meant carrying heavy baskets in all weather, and most servants avoided it. From then on, she bought the palace goods with the palace coin, and with her own tiny savings, coin by coin, she bought other things. A little dried meat from one stall, a small packet of healing herbs from another, never the same stall twice, never enough at once to be remembered. The money she had been keeping for 3 years, the money that was supposed to buy her a small life somewhere far away someday, began to melt like snow in spring. She never told Daniel where the food now came from, He was a king. He noticed anyway. "You are wearing the same shoes," he said one evening. He was sitting up on his own now, his back against the wall, color slowly returning to his face. "The left one has a hole near the toe. It had that hole 2 weeks ago. Servants here are given a shoe allowance twice a year. Yours was due." "You know the servant shoe allowance," Grace said flatly. "I wrote the servant shoe allowance," Daniel said. "My father's palace paid its people in promises. I changed that in my first year. So either my uncle has cancelled it, which I would believe, or you received it and spent it on something else." His storm-gray eyes did not move from her face. "Which is it, Grace?" She busied herself with the tea. "You ask too many questions for a man hiding in a burned corridor. You are spending your own money to feed me." "I am spending my own money," she said, "on the only plan I have ever had that is worth anything. Now drink your tea. It is more bitter tonight. The herb woman said it would help you sleep." He took the cup. He drank the bitter tea without a word. But the next evening, when she came to the hidden room, she found he had unpicked a seam in the collar of his ruined coat, the coat he had worn through 3 years of exile, and pressed something into her palm. A single gold piece, old and heavy, stamped with the wolf and moon of the royal house. "I carried 3 of these across the whole country," he said. "One bought a boatman's silence. One bought a healer's mercy. This is the last one. A king should not eat from a maid's savings." Grace looked at the coin, and then she did something no servant in the palace would have dared. She handed it back. "If anyone sees me with royal gold, I am dead by evening. And so are you," she said. "And besides, you will need it. Armies are expensive, I am told. Keep your coin, my king. Pay me back when you have a treasury again." For a long moment he simply looked at her, and something in his expression made her feel strangely warm and strangely seen, both at once. "You bargain like a market trader," he said finally. "I am a market trader's daughter," she said. "You knelt in the mud for him once, though you would not remember it. We settle our debts, and we do not take a customer's last coin. That is simply good business." That was the night his wolf stirred for the first time. It happened without warning. She was gathering the empty cups, telling him some small foolish story about the head cook's war with the palace cats, and Daniel laughed, and mid-laugh he suddenly went completely still. His hand flew to his chest, his breath caught. For one terrifying heartbeat, Grace thought the poison had reached his heart, and she was already moving toward him when he lifted his head. His eyes were glowing, not gray, gold, deep, burning, impossible gold, the color that belonged to alphas alone. The color that had been dead and dark for 3 years. "I can hear him," Daniel whispered. His voice shook, this man who had not flinched through fever and pain, and the worst news a king could receive. "Grace, I can hear my wolf. He is far away. He is weak, but he is there. The silver has not killed him. He is still there." The glow lasted only a few seconds. Then it faded, and his eyes were gray again, and he sat there breathing hard like a man who had run for miles. But the room felt different now. The whole world felt different. Grace realized her own cheeks were wet. "What made it happen?" she asked. "The tea? The herbs? I will buy the whole stall." "No," Daniel said slowly. He was looking at her in a new way, careful and wondering, as if she were a puzzle written in a language he had almost forgotten. "It was not the tea." He did not explain further, and something in his face told her not to ask. She was too happy to push. The king's wolf was alive. Somewhere beneath the frost of the silver, the true alpha of the Black Moon pack still breathed, and that meant everything they were doing, every risk, every coin, every lie, was not for nothing. Then came the 4th week, and with it, the announcement that changed the shape of time itself. Grace heard it standing in the great hall with 50 other servants, summoned to witness the regent's proclamation. Victor stood on the dais in robes of deep red, and she made herself look at him properly for the first time since the cellar. He was a handsome man, silver at his temples, warm smile, kind eyes. That was the horror of him. He looked like everyone's favorite uncle. He looked like a safe pair of hands. Only when you knew what he had done could you see the coldness that lived behind the warmth, like a blade in a velvet sheath. Beside him stood the spy master, thin and gray and still, watching the crowd instead of his master. 3 years I have carried this burden, Victor announced, and his voice broke in exactly the right place. and Grace marveled at how good he was. 3 years, I have kept my beloved nephew's throne warm, praying for a miracle that never came. The elders have now spoken. A pack cannot live forever in mourning. It needs a true alpha, fully crowned, fully bonded to the land. He paused. The hall was silent as deep water. On the night of the blood moon, 7 weeks from now, I will undergo the rite of the bloodline before the sacred stone, the old ritual of our ancestors. On that night, the alpha line of the Black Moon Pack will pass fully and forever into my body, and the wound of these 3 years will finally close. The hall erupted in dutiful cheering, because not cheering was dangerous. Grace cheered too, her hands moving, her face smiling, while inside her something screamed. She did not know exactly what the rite of the bloodline was, but she knew the word forever when she heard it, and she saw the way the spymaster's eyes moved slowly across the crowd of servants during the applause, patient and empty, like a fisherman, watching still water where he was certain, absolutely certain, that something was moving beneath the surface. That night she told Daniel, and for the first time since the cellar, she saw fear in him. The rite of the bloodline, he repeated. He had pushed himself to his feet, and was standing at the boarded window, staring through the gap in the planks at the lights of the palace he had been born in. It is not just a coronation, Grace. It is the oldest magic our people have. The sacred stone holds the bond between the alpha line and the land itself. Every alpha, back to the first wolves. The rite does not just crown a king, it rewrites the line. If Victor completes it, the stone will accept his blood as the true blood. He turned to face her, and the candlelight carved deep shadows under his eyes. I would not just lose the throne, the land itself would no longer know me. My wolf would be cut from the pack bond forever. There would be nothing left to return to, and no me left to return. Then we stop him, Grace said. In 7 weeks, Daniel said. 7 weeks to heal a poisoned body, wake a silenced wolf, find allies I cannot reach, and unseat a man with an army, while the cleverest man in the kingdom hunts for the very trail of crumbs that keeps me alive. He laughed, but there was no joy in it. I came back too soon, and too late in the same breath. I told myself I had time. Time to grow strong, time to plan, time to build. He has just taken time away from me. Grace crossed the room and stood in front of him, this tall, scarred, half-broken king, and she thought about her father picking his crushed vegetables out of the mud, one by one, and setting his stall upright again the very same afternoon. Then we do not build slowly, she said. We build fast, and we build with what we have. You need allies. Tell me their names. Not the lords and the generals. They are watched, and half of them have sold themselves to Victor by now. Tell me the ones he would never think to watch. Tell me the ones everyone else forgot. Daniel looked down at her, and slowly, through the fear, something else rose in his eyes. The thing she had seen in the cellar the night they met. The thing the silver could not poison. There is one, he said. If he is still alive. My second. My beta. My oldest friend. Henry. The official record says he fell in the same battle that killed me. But Victor never wastes what he can use. And Henry knew things about the northern defenses that no one else knew. He would not have killed him. He would have buried him somewhere alive and made him useful. Buried him where? There is only one place in this kingdom where useful men disappear, Daniel said. The silver mines. Grace felt the floor tilt slightly under her feet. The mines. The place at the edge of every servant's nightmares. The pit, at the end of the word gone. No one came back from the mines. No one even knew anyone who had come back from the mines. Well, she heard herself say, I have always wanted to see the countryside. The plan to reach the mines began with dirty laundry. Grace discovered it by accident, standing in the palace courtyard on washing day, watching the great carts roll out through the gates. The palace washed for itself, but it also washed for the regent's outposts, and among those outposts, once every 2 weeks, a cart carried clean uniforms and bedding to the guard barracks at the silver mines. The cart left with clean cloth and returned with dirty cloth, and the guards at the gates, who searched every wagon of food and every carriage of visitors, waved the laundry through with their noses wrinkled and their eyes elsewhere. Nobody searches what nobody wants to touch. Grace had built her whole survival on that truth, and now she would build a rescue on it too. But before the plan could take its first breath, the palace itself turned hostile. It started on a gray morning, with the ringing of the assembly bell, hard and fast, the rhythm that meant every servant, everywhere, drop everything and come. Grace's hands went cold in the washing water. She dried them, straightened her apron, and walked to the great hall with the others, and the fear under her uniform pressed close against her skin. The entire staff stood in rows between the pillars. Cooks, maids, grooms, gardeners, pages. At the front of the hall waited the steward, and beside him, in his dark plain clothes, stood the spymaster. Up close, he was smaller than fear had painted him. That made it worse somehow. He looked like a clerk. He looked like a man who counted things. "Someone in this palace is stealing," the spymaster said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Not gold, not jewels. Small things. Food, medicine, candles. Things a person steals when they are keeping something alive that they should not be keeping alive. Grace kept her eyes on the floor, and her breathing slow. Around her, 50 servants did the same, because under Victor's rule, everyone had learned the same statue stillness. "I am not a cruel man," the spymaster continued, walking slowly down the first row. "I understand hunger. If someone here has been feeding a sick mother in the lower town, or a child, step forward now, confess, and you will keep your post and lose only a month's wages. That is mercy. It expires this morning." Silence. The spymaster nodded slightly, as if the silence itself were an answer he had expected, and filed away. "Then we will do it the slower way," he said, and began to question them one by one. He did not shout, and he did not threaten. He asked small, soft questions, and he listened to the answers with his head tilted, like a man listening for the one wrong note in a song. When he reached Grace, her heart was beating so hard she was sure the whole hall could hear it. "Kitchen maid," he said, reading her from some invisible list in his mind. "You have taken market duty 11 times this month. Before this month, you took it twice a year. Why?" The truth, wrapped in a lie, tied with a truth. It was the only knot that held. "The new undercook, sir," Grace said. "He was given my baking duties. I did not want to be marked as idle and dismissed, so I took the duty nobody wants. My father always said the heaviest basket is the safest job." "Your father was a market trader. Lower town. Died 4 winters ago." The spymaster said it without looking at any paper, and Grace understood, with a feeling like cold water down her back, that he had already learned the bones of her whole small life. "You walk to the north corridor sometimes in the evenings. The burned wing. Why?" The hall seemed to shrink around her. Somewhere behind her ribs, panic threw itself against its cage, and she held the door shut and made her face confused and a little embarrassed. "The quiet, sir," she said. "The servant halls are crowded, 2 to a bed, 10 to a room. I go where I can hear my own thoughts. I sit by the corridor window and mend my clothes." She lifted the hem of her patched apron slightly, evidence stitched in thread. "It is not forbidden, sir. Is it?" The spymaster looked at her for 3 long seconds. In those seconds Grace thought of nothing, absolutely nothing, because she had a strange, mad certainty that he could hear thoughts moving the way she could hear whispers through walls. "No," he said at last. "It is not forbidden." And he moved to the next servant. She had survived. She began to breathe again. And then, at the far end of the hall, the head overseer of the kitchens, a heavy man named Bram who had bullied the staff for years and had been drinking since dawn, decided the morning was taking too long. "Enough coddling," Bram announced, grabbing the arm of the girl beside Grace, a scullery maid named Tilly, barely 15, who had begun to cry from pure fear. "This one is weeping. The guilty weep. Speak up, girl, or I will shake it out of you." "She weeps because you are hurting her arm," Grace said. She had not planned to say it. The words simply left her, clear and loud in the silent hall, and every head turned. Bram's face went from red to purple. He released Tilly, took 2 heavy steps, and struck Grace across the face with his open hand. The blow snapped her head sideways. The hall gasped. Grace tasted copper and saw white sparks, and she gripped her own apron with both hands and stayed on her feet, because falling felt like losing, and she was done losing to men like this. And far away, up under the roof of the great hall, where an old ventilation gallery ran hidden behind the carved stone screens, something happened that no one below could see. Daniel had followed her that morning. He had heard the assembly bell through the palace walls, counted the pattern, and known what it meant. and no force in the world could have kept him lying in that bed, while the spymaster picked through the staff hunting for Grace's trail. He had dragged his healing body through the servant passages she had mapped for him, up the narrow stair, into the dusty gallery above the hall, telling himself he only needed to see, only needed to know. He saw the blow land. The sound of it reached him half a heartbeat later, a small, flat, ugly sound, and the world went red and gold at the edges. His wolf, silent and distant for 3 years, was suddenly not distant at all. It surged up through the frost of the silver, like a flood through a broken dam, roaring one single word through his blood, and the word was hers. Mine. His hands crushed the stone edge of the screen. His eyes blazed gold in the darkness of the gallery. Every muscle in his body coiled to leap, to drop into that hall in front of 100 witnesses and the regent's spymaster, to put himself between her and the whole world. It was madness. It was the end of everything they had built, the end of both their lives, the end of the kingdom's last hope, all for one blow that Grace herself would have told him to ignore. He knew all of that, and he still almost jumped. What stopped him was Grace herself. Down in the hall, she lifted her head, cheek blazing red, eyes bright and dry, and she did not look at Bram at all. She looked at the spymaster, and she said, in a steady voice that carried to every corner, "I apologize for disturbing the questioning, sir. Please continue. We all want the thief found." It was perfect. It was armor made of obedience. The spymaster studied her with something that might almost have been appreciation, then turned a flat gaze on Bram. "If I need assistance frightening maids," he said, "I will ask for it. Get out." And the purple-faced overseer, suddenly pale, stumbled from the hall, and the questioning moved on, and the moment closed over like water. But up in the gallery, Daniel sat back against the cold stone, shaking, his eyes fading slowly from gold to gray, and faced the truth his wolf had just roared through him. The maid was his mate. The moon bond. The one wolves waited whole lifetimes for, and most never found. It had been there from the first night, he understood now. The pull she thought was hers alone. The thread in the chest. The way his dead wolf had stirred at her laughter. Fate had placed his other half in a cellar behind wine barrels, wearing a patched apron, carrying a candle, and he had been too poisoned and too broken to recognize her. He should have felt joy. Instead, sitting in the dust above the hall where she had just been struck for shielding a child, Daniel felt terror of a completely new kind. Everything Victor touched, he destroyed. Everything Daniel loved, Victor took. If the regent ever learned what Grace was to him, she would stop being a suspect and become a weapon. The cleverest man in the kingdom stood 20 feet below him, hunting a thread, and Daniel had just discovered that the thread led not to a hidden king, but straight through his own heart. So he made the hardest decision of his life, in the softest possible way. He decided to say nothing. That evening, when Grace came to the hidden room, with bread and stew and a bruise blooming on her cheekbone, Daniel rose from the bed, crossed the room, and stood in front of her. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and touched the edge of the bruise with fingers that were almost trembling. "I heard what happened," he said, which was true enough. "It looks worse than it is," Grace said. "Bram hits like he cooks. Badly." He did not laugh. His storm-gray eyes moved over her face, like he was reading something written there in letters only he could see, and the air in the little room went strangely still, strangely warm, and the thread in her chest hummed like a plucked string. "When this is over," Daniel said quietly, "no one will ever raise a hand to you again. I need you to know that I would burn the whole world before I let it happen twice." "That seems excessive for one slap," Grace whispered, but her voice came out unsteady, because the way he was looking at her was not the way a king looks at a maid, and some deep, quiet part of her had begun to suspect what the thread was, and was afraid to hope. Daniel stepped back. The moment folded itself away, unspoken. "Now," he said, turning to the small map of the kingdom they had drawn together on the back of an old fire notice, "tell me about the laundry cart." Grace rode to the silver mines buried under 200 pounds of dirty bedsheets. The laundry cart left the palace at first light, and she lay in the hollow she had built at its center, breathing through a gap in the cloth, listening to the wheels and the rain, and the heartbeat of her own fear. Daniel had fought her about this until midnight. He had demanded to go himself, had actually stood by the door with his coat on, and she had simply asked him one question. Can you run yet? He could not run yet. And a rescue where the rescuer cannot run is not a rescue, it is a delivery. So the king stayed behind the boarded window, and the maid went to the worst place in the kingdom, carrying nothing but a laundry list, a story, and a message sewn into the hem of a pillowcase. The mines announced themselves by smell before sight. Smoke and wet rock and misery. When the cart finally groaned to a stop and Grace slipped out at the laundry shed, playing the part of the palace washing girl sent along to count linens, she made herself look around slowly, the way a bored servant would, and what she saw she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Gray men in gray dust, moving in lines, thin as winter branches. Guards with silver-tipped rods watching them, the way farmers watch cattle. And over everything, the black mouths of the tunnels, exhaling cold air that smelled like the inside of a grave. Somewhere in that grayness was the king's beta. Her whole plan for finding him rested on one fragile idea. Every prison has a market, and every market has a fixer, and every fixer knows every name. She found him at the laundry shed itself, exactly where palace logic said he would be, because the man who handles the clean cloth handles the small comforts, and small comforts are the currency of terrible places. He was an older prisoner with clever eyes and a limp, sorting sheets with the speed of long practice, and when Grace mentioned, idly, servant to servant, that the palace had miscounted and sent one extra bale, and that she personally did not care where extra things ended up, his clever eyes sharpened with interest. They traded carefully, in half sentences, the way careful people do. She gave him the extra bale. Then needle thread by needle thread, she unpicked her true question. An old soldier, she said. Big man, northern accent, would have arrived about 3 years ago, probably kept apart from the others, because he knew things. The fixer's hands stopped sorting. You are not a washing girl, he said quietly. I am exactly a washing girl, Grace said. Washing girls are invisible, and invisible people hear things. I heard that man was loyal to the old king. There are people who still remember the old king kindly. That is all this is, old kindness. The fixer studied her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something buried and almost dead that her words had touched. 3 years ago, they brought in a man like that, he said at last, very low. No name. The guards call him the map maker. They keep him in the old overseer's hut, past the second shaft, away from everyone. Twice a year men come from the capital with papers, and he draws for them, and he weeps while he draws. The northern defenses, we think. They keep him breathing, because what is in his head is worth more than silver. He glanced toward the guard towers. You cannot reach that hut, girl, and if you could not bring him out. Men leave this place one way only. I do not need to bring him out today, Grace said. I need to bring him hope. Hope travels lighter than men. The pillowcase with the message sewn into its hem went to the overseer's hut that evening, among the clean linens, carried by the fixer himself, who had decided, for reasons he did not fully explain, that old kindness was worth one risk. Grace spent the night in the laundry shed with the returning cart, not sleeping, watching the lamp in the distant hut through a crack in the boards, and some hours after midnight, the lamp in the hut went out and came back twice. The signal from the message, received, understood, alive. Henry was alive. The reply came back the next morning, inside the same hem, re-sewn by hands that shook. In tiny cramped writing, Grace read in the rattling darkness of the homeward cart, and by the time she finished reading it, she understood that she was not carrying a letter. She was carrying a weapon. Henry had spent 3 years listening to the men who came with papers. Guards talk in front of prisoners the way lords talk in front of servants, because they do not count them as people. And so the mapmaker in the hut had quietly collected the whole shape of the crime. The battle at the northern border 3 years ago had been arranged, the enemy raiders paid in royal silver to attack on a chosen day, through a go-between whose name Henry had heard twice, and written now in careful letters. The wine had been prepared by the regent's own physician, who had since been rewarded with a fine house in the capital, and the order for all of it had been sealed not with words, but with the regent's private ring, on documents that the go-between, a careful and distrustful man, had insisted on keeping as protection. Proof. Written, sealed, hidden proof, held by a trader who lived under a false name, in the river district of the capital, sleeping every night beside the papers that could end Victor. And below all of it, in letters pressed so hard, the pen had torn the cloth, Henry had written one final thing. Tell him the blood moon rite needs the true blood to die first. That is the part they do not say aloud. The stone will not accept a second line while the first line lives. If Victor is preparing the rite, it means he knows. He knows the king survived. He has known for months. The border watch, the new patrols, the questions in the palace. It is not a coronation, it is a hunt, and the rite is the trap at the end of it. The blood moon is not his crowning night. It is the night he plans to have the true king found, delivered, and ended on the sacred stone itself. Grace lay in the darkness under the bedsheets, as the cart rolled home, holding the pillowcase against her chest, cold to her bones. They had thought they were hiding from a man who believed his crime was finished. They were actually hiding from a man who knew his crime was unfinished. A man who had turned the whole kingdom into a net and was drawing it closed with a calendar. 7 weeks had never been 7 weeks. 7 weeks was the length of the rope. She came through the hidden corridor that night, still dusty from the road, and Daniel rose from the map table the moment he saw her face. Henry is alive, she said, and watched 3 years of grief crack and fall away from him in a single breath, watched him grip the table edge, this man who had not broken for poison or pain, blinking hard at the news that his brother in everything but blood still breathed. She gave him that moment. He had earned that moment. Then she gave him the rest of it, all of it, the arranged battle, the physician, the go-between in the river district, the sealed papers, and last, in Henry's own torn writing, the truth about the rite. She watched the joy in his face turn to stone as he read it, and then to something colder and clearer than she had ever seen there before. He knows, Daniel said quietly. He knows, Grace said. So what do we do? Daniel set the cloth down on the map of the kingdom, over the capital, over the river district, over the palace where they stood, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were awake in a way that made her think of the moment before a storm finally breaks. He has been hunting a wounded, hiding, frightened man, Daniel said. So we take that man away from him. From tonight, he is hunting something else. He set the blood moon as the end of my time. Very well. It is now the end of his. 7 weeks from now, one of us will stand at that stone. He touched the tiny drawn square that marked the river district. And it starts with those papers. Proof first. Because I do not just need to take the throne back, Grace. I need to take it back in front of the whole pack, in the light, with the truth in my hand. Or I am only a stronger victor, and I did not crawl out of a river to become him. Grace looked at the map, at the 7 drawn moons along its edge counting down to the red one, and felt the fear under her uniform change shape. It was still fear. It would always be fear. But it stood up straighter now. The river district, she said. I know a fish seller there who owes my father's memory a favor. We should talk about boats. And for the first time since the seller, the hunted king smiled like a hunter. The trader in the river district never knew that the 4 people who changed his mind were a fish seller, a boat mender, a washerwoman, and a girl who sold candles on the bridge. This was Grace's answer to the problem of the sealed papers, and it was an answer no general in the kingdom would ever have thought of, because generals think in soldiers and gates, and Grace thought in people and kitchens. The go-between could not be robbed. His house sat on the water with 1 door, iron shutters, and 2 paid watchmen, and he trusted no one, which was how he had stayed alive holding papers that could sink a regent. But a man who trusts no one still buys fish. He still has his washing done. He still crosses the bridge at dusk and buys a candle from the same girl every evening, because her stall is the last one before his street. Untrusting men are not unreachable. They are simply reachable only by the invisible. So Grace built her net out of the invisible, and she built it on the oldest currency the lower town had, older than coin, stronger than fear, her father's name. 4 winters dead, and the market still remembered the trader who gave credit in hard months, and never once collected a debt from a widow. Grace walked through the river district on her market days, and to the right people, in the right doorways, she said the old man's name, and doors that Victor's gold could never opened for his daughter. She did not tell them about the king. The secret stayed sealed inside the burned wing, where it belonged. She told them something both smaller and larger, that proof existed of what the regent truly was, that hands were reaching for it, that the whisperers of the lower town, the ones who had lost fathers and sons to the word gone, could either help those hands or keep scrubbing floors for the man responsible. She never once had to finish the speech. The washerwoman learned from the go-between's linens that he suffered from sleepless nights and drank a calming tea from the eastern markets. The fish seller learned from his cook that he feared fire above all things, in a wooden house on a wooden dock. The boatmender learned that the watchmen changed at midnight and shared a lazy quarter-hour of talk when they did, and the candle girl on the bridge, sweet and chatty and completely beneath notice, learned over 3 weeks of dusk conversations that the careful man was tired of holding a blade by its edge, tired of sleeping beside papers that made him the second most dangerous loose end in the kingdom. And careful men know exactly what happens to loose ends once their usefulness ages. That was the thread Daniel seized on when Grace brought it all to the map table. He is not guarding treasure, Daniel said slowly. He is guarding his own death sentence, and he knows it. When the rite is complete, and Victor is untouchable, those papers stop protecting him and start condemning him. A blackmail letter only has power, while the secret can still wound. He looked up. We do not steal the papers, Grace. We buy them, with the one coin he actually wants. A way out. The offer reached the go-between the way everything reached him now, invisibly. Folded inside his laundered shirts, in plain, careful writing. We know what you hold. We know what happens to you at the Blood Moon. There is a boat, a heavy purse, and a foreign harbor with your name on none of it. The price is the box, with every seal unbroken. You have 5 days, and you should know the tea you drink each night is bought by us. The fish on your table is sold by us, and the candle that lights your window came from our hands. We have been beside you for weeks and you never saw us. Consider what that means, both as promise and as warning. For 2 days, nothing. On the 3rd evening, the go-between stopped at the candle stall on the bridge, bought his usual candle, and told the girl, in passing, as if remarking on the weather, that the harbor sounded pleasant this time of year. The exchange happened at midnight during the watchman's lazy quarter hour, on the water, between 2 fishing boats that touched sides for less than a minute. Grace was in one of them. She had refused every argument against it, including the king's, on the simple grounds that the net was hers, and a fisherman does not send strangers to pull it. A locked iron box passed one way, a purse and a set of harbor papers passed the other. Not a word was spoken. By the time the moon cleared the clouds again, the boats were apart, and by sunrise, the go-between's house stood empty, with its iron shutters open, and the most dangerous man in the kingdom did not yet know that his death sentence had changed hands. In the burned wing, by candlelight, Daniel opened the box with hands that were steady, until the moment they were not. It was all there, the payment orders for the raiders, sums and dates in a clerk's tidy columns. The physician's letter, cautious and vile, discussing doses in the language of medicine, and beneath them, the thing that made the king of the Black Moon Pack sit down slowly on a servant's stool, as if his legs had been taken from him. A single page in Victor's own confident hand, sealed with the private wolf and moon ring, instructing that the matter of the northern border be concluded on the agreed day, and that afterward his nephew's body be recovered quickly, before the river carried it beyond reach, for the pack must have its funeral, and grief, properly presented, crowns a man better than gold. Grief, properly presented, crowns a man better than gold. Grace read the line over his shoulder, and felt sick in a way no rocking boat had managed. Daniel sat with the page in both hands for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. He wrote this at my table, he said. I know the ink, I know the paper stock. He sat at my own council table, in the chair at my right hand, and wrote the order for my funeral before I was dead. He set the page down with a care that was more frightening than rage. Thank you, Grace, for the box, and for being here while I read it, because I find I could not have read it alone. She reached out, not entirely deciding to, and rested her hand over his on the table. His fingers turned beneath hers and held on. The candle burned. The thread in her chest pulled taut and sang, and neither of them moved, and the little dusty room felt, for one suspended moment, like the exact center of the world. Daniel looked from their joined hands up to her face, and there was a question rising in his storm-gray eyes, rising slowly against the weight of every reason he had built for silence, and Grace felt her heart lean toward it like a plant toward light. The alarm bells began to ring. Not the assembly bell. All the bells. The great bronze voices of the palace, every one of them at once, crashing through the night in a pattern Grace had never heard in her life. And beneath them, rising from the courtyards, the sound of the garrison, turning out at a run. She was at the boarded window in a heartbeat, eye to the gap in the planks, and what she saw below emptied the warmth from her body. Torches. Hundreds of torches, flooding the courtyards, forming into search columns. Riders streaming out of the main gates in every direction. And on the high balcony of the royal wing, small and sharp against the lit windows, the unmistakable thin figure of the spymaster, directing the columns with movements of one hand, calm as a clerk, while the palace boiled beneath him. Then the criers began, their voices cutting through the bells, repeating a proclamation over and over into the night, and with each repetition, the words came clearer through the boards. By order of the regent, the right of the bloodline is moved forward, to the full moon. In celebration, the palace opens its doors. Every servant is summoned to new quarters in the main wing, that all may be honored and none forgotten. The old wings close tonight, and are sealed, and searched, for the safety of all. The full moon. Not 7 weeks away. Not 5. The full moon was in 3 days, and the burned wing, invisible for years, forgotten by everyone, was about to be opened, emptied, and searched, and the search columns with their torches were already turning north. The go-between's empty house had been found. Victor had stopped hunting quietly, and somewhere below, doors had begun to slam, one corridor at a time, coming closer. Daniel was already moving, sweeping the papers back into the iron box, his face carved from stone. Grace turned from the window and met his eyes across the candlelight. 3 days, she said. 3 days, she said. And about 3 minutes to stop being here. They ran through the walls of the palace, while the palace hunted them through its halls. Grace led, candle snuffed, one hand trailing the cold stone, navigating by memory and fingertips through the servant passages she had walked 1,000 times. Behind her came Daniel, with the iron box strapped across his back, moving better than he had in weeks, but still not well, still not fast. His breath a controlled rasp in the dark. Around them, muffled by the walls, the palace roared, boots in the corridors. Doors kicked open. The bells, always the bells, and beneath everything, closer every minute, the methodical slamming that meant the search columns were clearing the north wing room by room. Her plan had 3 doors in it. The first, the old coal chute to the outer yard, they reached in 11 minutes and found lit torches and 4 guards. The second, the drain gate by the kitchens, had a new lock on it, shining and oiled, and Grace stared at it in the dark and understood with cold admiration that the spymaster had spent his weeks well. He had never found their room, so instead he had quietly, patiently, locked every rat hole in the palace, and tonight he had simply picked up the whole building and begun to shake it. 1 door left. The condemned stair behind the old chapel half collapsed, dropping into the crypt passages that ran beneath the palace and came up, eventually, inside the walled orchard by the east gate. From the orchard, in festival chaos, with hundreds of wagons arriving for the rite, a man could vanish into the countryside. Grace had saved it for last because it was the worst. The crypt passages flooded in rain, the stair was rotten, and the chapel sat 1 corridor away from the guards' own barracks. They never got to find out if it would have worked. The betrayal was waiting for them at the chapel corridor, and it wore the tear-streaked face of Tilly, the little scullery maid Grace had shielded in the great hall. She stood in the archway with a lantern, and behind her stood the spymaster, and behind him, filling the corridor, a wall of guards. There was no ambush shout, no rush of boots. The thin gray man simply raised one hand, and the corridor filled with light from both ends, and Grace and Daniel stopped in the center of it, caught like moths in a cupped palm. "Do not blame the child," the spymaster said, in his quiet clerk's voice. "She holds no grudge against you. Quite the opposite. She wept for an hour." He tilted his head. 3 days ago, her brother was arrested on the word of an informant. Tonight she was offered his life in exchange for one honest answer to one simple question. What does the kitchen maid do in the evenings? Children watch the people who are kind to them, you see, far more closely than they watch the people who are cruel. It is always, always the kindness that leaves the trail. Tilly was sobbing now, the lantern shaking in her small hands. "He said they would let Colin go. Grace, I am sorry. He said they would let him go. I know, Grace said gently. It is all right, Tilly. It was never your fault. Men like him build traps out of love, because they have none of their own to spring them with. She said it looking straight at the spymaster, and had the small satisfaction of seeing something flicker, just once, behind the clerk's eyes. But the spymaster was no longer looking at her. He was looking at Daniel, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the gray man's composure moved. Not much. A slow intake of breath, a fractional widening of the eyes, as 3 years of careful theory stood before him in the flesh, wearing a dead man's face above a laundered servant's coat. So, he said softly, the river truly did give you back. I told him. I counted the patrol reports, the border sightings, the pattern of it, and I told him, and even he half believed you were a ghost story. He recovered himself, straightened, and became a clerk again. Daniel, son of the old king, by warrant of the regent, you will come with us. If you surrender the box on your back, and yourself, I am authorized to promise that the girl will be released unharmed. You have my word, for whatever a man like you counts it worth. Nothing, Daniel said. I count it worth nothing. You are the accountant of every grave in this kingdom for 3 years. That is fair, the spymaster said, without heat. Then count the corridor instead. 14 men here. 20 more within a minute of my whistle. You are unarmed, half-poisoned, and carrying paper. Even alphas, I am told, cannot fight arithmetic. And that was when Grace felt Daniel's hand touch her back, and felt him press against her spine, quickly and secretly, the hard corner of the iron box. She understood the whole plan in that single touch, understood it, and hated it instantly. The condemned stair was 6 steps behind them. It would take the guards precious seconds to clear the archway. One person, running alone, unburdened, might make the crypt in the dark. 2 would not. And the box, the truth, the proof, the whole point of everything, weighed almost nothing on a maid's back, and everything on a kingdom's future. He was not going to escape and leave her. He was going to surrender to buy her the seconds, because the spymaster's arithmetic had one error in it. It assumed the king was the treasure, and the maid was the hostage. It had not imagined that the king might value the cargo, and the carrier above himself. No, she breathed. They need me alive until the moon, Daniel murmured, lips barely moving. The right requires it. That gives you 3 days. Henry's letter told you where. The whisperers will know how. Grace, my people found me a reason to come back from the dead once already. It was you. Trust me to manage it a second time. I said no. And I am the king, he whispered, and she heard, impossibly, the smile in it. Consider it my first decree. Then he stepped forward, away from her, both hands rising, drawing every torch and every eye in the corridor toward himself like a tide. And his voice when he spoke was not a fugitive's voice at all. It rolled down the stone like the voice from the portrait in the great hall, the voice of the man 10,000 wolves had followed north. I am Daniel, son of the old king, alpha of the Black Moon Pack, and I surrender to no regent, but I will walk with you to my uncle, because I have 3 years of words for him. He took another step, and the wall of guards, men who had mourned him, men whose fathers had served his father, actually swayed backward from him like grass in wind. Which of you will put the chains on your king? Come, it will be a story for your grandchildren. Choose the man. Not one of them moved. The corridor hung frozen. 14 armed men, rooted by the sound of dead royalty, and in that stolen sliver of time, Grace made the worst decision of her life, which was to obey him. She spun. She reached the condemned stair in 4 silent strides, and she went down into the crypt dark with the truth strapped to her back, and her heart tearing loose behind her. The last thing she heard from the corridor above was the spymaster's voice, still quiet, almost respectful, saying, "Take him, gently, he is needed whole." And then the darkness and the underground water swallowed every sound in the world except her own ragged breathing. She did not remember most of the crypt. She remembered cold water to her knees, and turning left at the fallen angel, and a rat's eyes like sparks, and then the smell of apples, and rain on her face, and she was on her knees in the walled orchard mud, between 2 festival wagons, while the palace behind her lit up window by window like a great beast waking. By morning, the criers were in every square of the capital, and their proclamation reached Grace in the back room of the fish seller's house in the river district. where she sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, with an iron box on her lap, listening through the shutters. The pretender is taken, a madman wearing a beloved dead face, captured creeping through the palace with a servant girl he had deceived into aiding him. The regent, in his mercy and wisdom, will not soil the festival with a trial of lies. At the rising of the full moon, before the sacred stone, in the sight of the whole gathered pack, the pretender will face the old justice, and the right will proceed, and the wound of 3 years will close forever. All are summoned, all will witness. And then, at the end, the words she knew were meant not for the crowds but for her, a message dropped into the ocean of the city, in the certainty that it would find her. The deceived servant girl is offered clemency. Let her return what was stolen from the palace, and stand witness at the stone, and all will be forgiven her. Grace sat very still, in the fish-smelling dark, 3 days from the full moon, hunted, alone, holding a kingdom's worth of truth in a box on her knees. All will be forgiven, she repeated softly. Somewhere below the fear, in the place her father's stubbornness lived, something that was not fear at all, bared its teeth. No, it will not. Not one single day of it. Then she stood up, dried her face, and asked the fish seller to gather the whisperers before noon. Grace had 3 days to raise an army, and she did not raise an army. She raised something Victor had no defense against, because he had never once, in his entire clever life, counted it as a threat. She raised the servants of a kingdom. It began at noon, in the fish seller's back room, with 11 people around a table, and it spread the way water spreads, downward and everywhere, through channels no spymaster had ever mapped, because no spymaster had ever considered them worth mapping. The washerwoman told the laundresses of 3 great houses, the candle girl told the market, the boat mender told the rivermen, and the rivermen told the dockhands, and by nightfall of the first day, the invisible people of the capital knew 2 things that the criers had not told them. The pretender was no pretender, and the proof existed. Grace did not ask them to fight. That was the heart of it, the reason it worked. She asked each of them for one small thing, one servant-sized thing, the kind of thing they already did, every single day. She asked the palace grooms, when the moment came, to be slow with the horses of certain loyal lords. She asked the gate porters to find certain locks troublesome, and certain bolts stuck. She asked the festival cooks to seat the regent's paid witnesses far from the front, and the ushers to guide the families of the disappeared close to it. She asked the crier's own errand boys, who hated their masters, to learn a different proclamation by heart, and wait for a signal, and she asked the bell ringers of the 7 towers of the capital, whose grandfathers had rung the true king's birth, whether they remembered the joy peal, the pattern struck only for the crowning of the rightful line, the pattern no living regent could order rung, and no gathered wolf could fail to know in their bones. The bell ringers remembered. The second day, she went for Henry, and the mines that no one had ever escaped were opened by a laundry list. The palace, drowning in festival labor, had summoned workers from every royal holding, and a requisition order arrived at the silver mines for 20 strong prisoners for heavy lifting, sealed and stamped and correct in every detail, because it had been written by the same forger who repaired the harbor master's documents for the river smugglers, a man who owed the fish seller his boat and his life. The guards at the mines, terrified of failing the great occasion, filled the quota within the hour. The fixer with the clever eyes made certain a certain gray-bearded mapmaker was among the 20, and made certain besides to add himself. Grace met the prison guard on the Capitol Road at dusk, in a laundress's cloak, and watched a mountain of a man climb down with 3 years of the dark in his face, scanning the crowd with a soldier's eyes, until he found hers, the stranger, who had sewn hope into a pillowcase. "You are Grace," Henry said. His voice was gravel and rust. "You are late," she said. "We have a king to crown in a day and a half, and he is currently in chains." Something came alive in the big man's ruined face, something the mines had buried but never killed, and when it surfaced, Grace finally understood what a beta of the Black Moon pack had been, back when the pack had teeth. In chains, at the sacred stone, in front of the whole gathered pack, Henry said slowly, tasting the shape of the battlefield. "The fool. Victor has spent 3 years keeping his crime in the dark, and now, for the sake of one night of theater, he is carrying it up a mountain and setting it in front of 10,000 witnesses." He looked at Grace, and the gravel voice dropped. "Do you understand, girl?" He is so certain the truth is dead that he is inviting the entire kingdom to its execution. If the truth can be made to stand up and speak on that mountainside, there is no army on earth that can protect him from what happens next. Then we make it stand up and speak, Grace said, and opened the iron box. The night of the full moon came down clear and cold, and the sacred mountain wore a crown of 10,000 torches. The pack had come as summoned, all of it, lords in their furs and farmers in their patched wool, the ancient terraces around the stone filling from the first stars onward, and moving among that ocean of people, invisible as always, went the servants, carrying trays, tending torches, guiding guests to their places. Every 10th one of them carrying, folded small against their skin, a copied page from an iron box, waiting for a signal. Grace climbed the mountain in the crowd, hooded, a water carrier's yoke across her shoulders, and no guard looked twice, because no guard had ever looked twice at her in her entire life, and tonight, that lifelong invisibility was a blade in her hand. Ahead, at the summit, the sacred stone stood in a ring of fire, ancient and black, its carved moons worn soft by 1,000 years of crownings. She could see the regent's pavilion. She could see the physician, honored guest, in the second row. She could see the spymaster, gray and still at the edge of the light, watching everything, and she pulled the water yoke lower, and became nothing at all, as his gaze slid past. And then drums, and the crowd's breath catching all at once, and they brought out the king. He walked in silver chains, and the sight of him rolled through 10,000 people like a physical wave, because the criers had said madman and pretender, but the mountain said otherwise. The torchlight said otherwise. The face above the chains was the face from the portrait, the face from the memorial stone, older, scarred, but unmistakably, impossibly his, and Grace heard the murmur begin around her in the dark, low and vast, like the first sound of a distant flood. She heard a farmer whisper, "That is him," and a woman answer, "The dead do not walk," and the farmer say again, "That is him, that is my king. I marched behind that face." Victor heard it too. Grace watched from 30 feet away, as the regent rose in his crimson robes, and she understood that he had prepared for this exact moment, and her stomach turned to stone at how good he was. "Look well," Victor called, and his voice was rich with sorrow. "Look upon my dead nephew's stolen face, and understand at last what we fight. 3 years, this creature was crafted, cut and healed and trained by our enemies in the north, taught his walk, his voice, his childhood memories, and sent among us to shatter the pack on the eve of its healing. Do you see now why the right cannot wait? While the true line lies unsealed, any thief may wear it." He turned to the chained man, and real tears shone in the torchlight, and Grace realized the monster had made himself believe it, in this moment, for this performance. "Whatever you are, I forgive you for wearing his face, but the stone forgives nothing. When the moon crests, the old justice will fall, the right will seal the line beyond theft, and this pack will finally sleep in peace." The crowd wavered. Grace felt it waver. 10,000 hearts caught between the evidence of their eyes, and 3 years of trained fear, and she saw that Henry had been right and wrong at once. The truth was standing on the mountainside, but it was in chains, and grief was standing over it with a better story, and stories, well told, beat truth in the dark. So Grace set down her water yoke, drew a breath from the very bottom of her life, and gave the signal. She began to sing. Alone, one voice, thin in the enormous night, she sang the moon greeting, the old pack song that opened every festival of the free years, the song no gathering had dared to raise since the disappearances began, the song of a pack that was not afraid. Heads turned toward her in the dark, the spymaster's gray face swung around, searching, and before his searchers could move, before Victor's mouth had finished opening, the whisper network answered her. 100 servant voices caught the song across the terraces. Then the families of the disappeared, seated close by ushers' quiet hands, rose and joined, and the song leapt from mouth to mouth up the ancient stone steps, like fire up a dry hillside. The farmers took it. The rivermen took it. The old soldiers took it and wept as they sang, and in the ringing dark below the summit, 10,000 voices told the regent of the Black Moon Pack, in melody, in the oldest words they owned, that his kingdom of silence was over. And through the thunder of it, folded pages began to move hand to hand through the crowd like white birds, and torch by torch, terrace by terrace, The pack began to read. The song broke Victor's story, and the pages broke his mask. And what stood revealed on the summit when both were gone was no longer a grieving uncle. It was a cornered king of lies, watching his own sealed handwriting multiply through 10,000 hands by torchlight. He tried words first, because words had built his whole reign. Forgeries, he called them, enemy craft, poison for the pack's ears on its holiest night, and perhaps a month earlier the words would have held, but the pages had his seal, and the physician named in them had already been recognized in the second row, and the crowd around that unlucky man was drawing away as from something spoiled, and his face, gray and collapsing, confessed more loudly than any page. The murmur of the crowd deepened into something with an edge on it. On the terraces, the regent's guards gripped their spears and looked at the ocean of people around them, and did the arithmetic the spymaster had once been so fond of, and found it pointed the other way. And then, over all of it, a chain rattled, and the prisoner at the stone spoke for the first time, and the mountain fell silent to hear him. "Uncle," Daniel said, "you taught me the pack laws yourself, on the terrace of my father's house, when I was a boy. So teach them once more, before all of us. Tell the pack what the oldest law says a chained man may demand, at the sacred stone, under a full moon, from the one who chained him." Grace saw Victor's face change, and understood that whatever the words meant, they were a trap with only one exit, and Victor was standing in it in front of 10,000 witnesses. It was an old woman who answered, one of the mountain elders, her voice cracked and carrying. "The challenge," she said, "the stone challenge. Alpha against claimant, before the stone and the moon and the pack. No guards, no blades, no chains. The old way. The stone hears the blood of the winner, and the pack follows what the stone hears. It is the law beneath every law. It cannot be refused." She lifted her staff toward the summit, and her old voice rang out like a bell. "It cannot be refused, Victor. Not by a regent. Not by anyone. Refuse it, and no wolf on this mountain is bound to you past sunrise." The pack roared its agreement, the sound crashing off the stone, and Grace watched the trap close. Victor could not decline without dissolving his own rule in front of everyone, and she saw the exact heartbeat when his fear curdled into confidence, saw him look at his nephew, at the silver scars, the too thin frame, the 3 poisoned years hanging on him like winter, and she went cold, because Victor was not wrong. He was 20 years older, but he was whole, well-fed, trained daily in his private yard, and his wolf was strong, and Daniel's wolf had barely whispered through the frost. That, Grace realized with horror, was why Victor smiled as he unclasped his crimson robe. The challenge did not frighten him. The challenge was better theater than an execution. "Strike the chains," Victor said. "Let the stone decide." They met in the fire ring as the moon crested the summit, and the pack pressed close around the ancient boundary that no one, by law older than memory, could cross, and Grace stood at its very edge, with Henry's huge hand clamped on her shoulder, holding her there, and she watched the man she loved fight for the world, with a body that had not finished coming back from the dead. It went the way she had feared. Daniel was skilled, beautifully skilled. 3 years of survival had stripped his fighting down to something spare and precise, and for the first minutes, skill was enough. But the silver was still in him, and strength is a well, and his well was shallow. She saw him slow. She saw Victor see it. The older man began to spend his strength freely, driving his nephew back across the ring, and the torchlight showed the frost-gray lines rising dark on Daniel's skin, as his laboring blood carried the old poison hard, and when he went down the first time, 10,000 people made a sound like the mountain itself flinching. He rose. He went down again by the ring's edge, close to her, so close she could hear his breathing, ragged and losing, and Victor stood back and let him struggle, playing to the crowd, showing the pack a merciful Victor, and Grace heard him say, gently, for the front rows, "Yield, boy. The stone will accept a yielding. You do not have to end here." And she heard beneath the gentleness, the absolute certainty, that either answer served him, because a yielded king was a finished king. And Daniel, on his knees in the firelight, his wolf, a distant, drowning whisper beneath the silver frost, looked for her. Not for hope. She understood that later. He was looking for her the way a man looks at the reason for a thing, at the answer to the question of why get up, and Grace looked back at him across the boundary line, and every rule of every plan said a witness stays silent, stays invisible, stays safe. And Grace had spent her whole life being silent and invisible and safe. And she had whispered those words to him once in a cellar, and saved him with them. And she understood, in one blazing moment, that the same words would now end him, and that everything, all of it, the candle, the cellar, the thread in her chest pulling taut enough to break, had been leading to their opposite. She tore free of Henry's hand, threw back her hood at the boundary's edge, and gave the last order of the whisper network at the top of her voice. Don't stay silent. Roar. The words struck him like lightning finding ground. And the thread between them, pulled tight across weeks of silence and secrecy and everything unsaid, snapped home at last, and the moon bond opened in full, and what poured through it was everything she was, her stubbornness, her father's mud-stained dignity, her 3 years of swallowed fear, her love, undisguised and blazing, and it reached the drowning wolf beneath the silver frost, like a rope reaches a man under ice. Daniel roared. It was not a sound a human throat makes. It rolled out of him and down the mountain, the true call of the Black Moon Alpha line, unheard for 3 years, and every wolf on the terraces felt it in their marrow, felt the pack bond flare like a struck match after a long dark, and 10,000 throats answered it, in a single crash of sound that Grace felt in her teeth, and her bones, and the ground itself. The frost-gray lines on Daniel's skin cracked like river ice in spring. Gold flooded his eyes and stayed, and he rose from his knees with the bond blazing through him, not healed, not spared one scar of his 3 broken years, but whole where it finally mattered, a king with his wolf, and his pack, and his mate, and the fight after that was short. He did not destroy his uncle. Grace watched, heart hammering, as Daniel did something crueler and far better. He defeated him simply, cleanly, completely, took the challenge from him the old way, and put him down unharmed on the stone he had schemed for, pinned and beaten and alive, in front of everyone, stripped of the only thing Victor had ever truly possessed, which was the appearance of strength. And then, standing over him in the firelight, the true alpha of the Black Moon Pack rendered the only justice with teeth enough to fit the crime. No grave for you, Daniel said, loud enough for the mountain. Graves gather sympathy, and you taught me yourself that grief, properly presented, crowns a man. No. You will live, uncle. You will live in the mines you filled, at the labor you set, under the guard's rules you wrote, for every year the moon gives you, and the pack will forget your name, while you are still alive to hear the silence. That is my sentence. The stone has heard whose blood stands. The stone had heard. The ancient carvings were shining, moon-white, the light rising through them like dawn through water, and the elders were already crying it out. The line holds, the line holds, the stone knows its blood. Below, growing up the mountainside from the capital, from tower to tower across the valley, 7 bells began the joy peal, the crowning pattern, rung by grandfathers' grandsons, who had waited their whole lives with their hands on the ropes. And the spymaster, gray and quiet at the edge of the firelight, looked at the risen king, and the roaring pack, and the shining stone. Then he took out the small black book that held 10,000 secrets, walked through the crowd, which parted from him in dread, and laid it at Grace's feet, of all feet, and stood waiting with his wrists together, saying, in his clerk's voice, to no one's understanding but hers, "You were the thread all along. I searched 3 years for a great conspiracy, and it was a maid who liked the quiet. I would rather be judged by whatever you are than pardoned by anything I have served." Grace looked down at the book of the disappeared, and up at the man made of arithmetic, and found she was too full of bells and roaring and blazing gold eyes crossing the fire ring toward her to answer him at all. The kingdom learned the truth of what had happened on the mountain, the way it had learned everything important for 3 years, from the servants first, and by sunrise the roads into the capital were rivers of people coming to see with their own eyes that the impossible had held through the night. It had held. The gates of the palace stood open, truly open, for the first time in 3 years, and the wolf and moon banner flying above them was the old one, the true one, brought out of hiding by a porter who had kept it folded under his floorboards through the whole long dark, waiting. The first weeks of the restored reign were not made of feasts. Daniel would not allow feasts while the mines were still emptying. Cart after cart came down from the north, carrying home the gone, the taken, the disappeared, thin men and women blinking at the daylight, and at the palace gates, the spy master's black book was opened, and clerks read names aloud from dawn to dusk, so that families would finally know. Some names came home walking. Some names came home only as names, and for those the king stood at the gates himself, day after day, and heard every one, because he said a king who cannot carry his people's grief has no business carrying their crown. The physician and the go-between's masters and every hand the iron box had named faced trial in open court, in daylight, with the pack watching, because Daniel kept the promise he had made in a burned corridor. No quiet endings, no convenient disappearances. The truth, in the light, or it was not justice at all. Victor went north in an unmarked cart, in prisoner's gray, and the crowds who gathered to watch him pass did the worst thing crowds can do to a man who lived his whole life for their eyes. On a whispered word that ran ahead of the cart all the way to the mines, they turned their backs. Street after street, town after town, the whole road north, silence and turned backs, and not one person ever spoke his name in public again. And the sentence was carried out exactly as spoken. Tilly's brother Colin came home in the first cart. Grace met them both at the gates herself, and when the weeping girl tried to kneel and beg forgiveness, Grace lifted her up and held her, and told her the plain truth, that the fault belonged to the man who had built the trap, and never to the child caught in it. And then she gave Tilly a place in her own household, which told the whole palace everything it needed to know about what the new age would be. Because there was a new household, and the palace was learning, with delight and confusion, whose it was. The pack knew the story by now. It had crossed the kingdom faster than the joy peal, growing as it ran. The tale of the maid and the cellar and the candle, the maid and the laundry cart, the maid and the iron box, the maid whose voice had raised the mountain in song and broken the silver with 4 words. Mothers were already naming daughters after her, and the whole pack watched, holding its breath, wondering what a king does with a debt the size of a kingdom owed to a girl with a patched apron. Daniel answered the question at the first full gathering of the restored court, with every lord and elder and half the capital's commons packed into the great hall, and he answered it in a way no one had imagined, because he began by leaving the throne empty and walking down from the dais, down all 7 steps, to the floor where everyone else stood. "I owe this pack an accounting," he said, "of how your king came home. So hear it plainly. I did not fight my way back. I was carried. By a fish seller, a boat mender, a washerwoman, a candle girl, a bell ringer, a prison fixer, a laundry cart, and a maid, who spent her life savings on a stranger and asked for nothing back. The lords fought bravely at the end, and I honor it. But the kingdom was saved from below. It was saved by everyone this palace has ever looked past, and a king who learns that lesson and then goes back to listening only to lords deserves to lose his throne to the next liar with a warm smile." He turned then, in front of everyone, to where Grace stood at the side of the hall, dressed plainly still, half hidden behind Henry, exactly where a lifetime of invisibility had taught her to stand. "Grace," the king said, "daughter of a market trader of the lower town, come here, please." The whole hall turned. She crossed the floor with her heart pounding louder than it had in the cellar, in the mines, on the mountain, because guards and spy masters were one kind of terror, and 1,000 watching eyes were entirely another, and she stopped in front of him, and fixed him with a look that promised trouble later, and the storm-gray eyes were laughing at her, and then they were not laughing at all. The Alpha King of the Black Moon Pack knelt on the stone floor of his own great hall. The sound the crowd made was like the sea. Daniel took her hands, both of them, rough Maid's hands in his scarred ones, and what he said he did not say quietly for her alone, because he had hidden this truth once for her safety, and had sworn on the mountain never to hide it again. "You know what you are to me. You have known since the fire ring, when the bond opened, and you have felt what I feel, so I will not stand here and describe it badly. The moon made us for each other. That part was never a choice, and I would not want it to be. But this part is." His hands tightened on hers. "I am not asking you to be my mate. The moon settled that without consulting either of us, which was rude of it. I am asking you to be my wife, and my Luna, and the other half of this crown. I am asking you to rule, Grace, not beside me. With me, every decision, every day, your voice equal to mine, because I have seen what this kingdom looks like when it is run by one man's voice. and I have seen what it looks like when it is saved by yours." The hall was absolutely silent, 100 people not breathing. "You are asking a maid to be queen," Grace said, and her voice only shook a little. "No," Daniel said. "I am asking the woman who outplanned, outfought, and outstubborned the entire kingdom to please stop pretending she is only a maid and come do openly what she has been doing in secret all along, which is running it properly." And Grace laughed, wet-eyed, in front of the whole gathered pack, and said the words that the bell ringers, who had refused to leave their towers all week in hope of exactly this moment, sent crashing across the capital in the joy peal before she had even finished saying them. Well, somebody has to. They were married under the next full moon, on the mountain, at the sacred stone, and the pack sang the whole night through, 3 years of swallowed songs paid back with interest under the open sky. And the rain that followed became the one the pack still measures every other rain against, because Luna Grace kept the promise of who she was. The Whisper Network was never disbanded. It was crowned. It became the Common Council, the first of its kind in any pack anywhere, a permanent seat at the royal table for the servants, the traders, the farmers, the rivermen, the invisible, with the fish seller as its first speaker, and the candle girl from the bridge, in time, as its most feared negotiator, and no king of the Black Moon line has ruled without it since. The gray man who had laid his black book at Grace's feet served out his own strange sentence. 10 years of using his terrible gifts to find the lost instead of making them, and it is said he located every last name in the book before the end, and that it was the only work of his life that ever let him sleep. Henry took up his old place at the king's right hand and held it for 30 years, and never once let Daniel forget that he had been rescued from the inescapable mines by a laundry list. And if you had visited the palace in those years, and been curious, and asked the right servant, they might have taken you down the cellar stairs, past the wine barrels, to the last row against the wall, where the lamps were always kept lit by standing royal order. There, behind the third barrel, you would have found a small brass plaque, polished every morning for decades by the king's own hand, or the queen's, whichever of them woke first, marking the spot where a dying man once hid in the dark, and a girl with a candle chose not to run. The plaque bears no crown, no wolf, no moon, only a single line. Here, a maid saved a kingdom with 2 words, and underneath it, added years later in smaller letters, at the queen's insistence and over the king's laughing objection, a second line, because Grace always did believe in telling the whole truth. And with 4 more, she taught it to roar.